Hello, everyone. We're going to give just a minute because I see people logging in fairly quickly right now. So I'm just going to start in maybe 30 seconds.
Yeah, that does mean that I'll be muted throughout the whole meeting.
All right, I think we'll get started. Welcome, everyone, to the 20th Annual New Sweden History Conference. At last year's conference, we could have never anticipated that we would be doing a conference in this format this year. I'm Tracey Beck. I'm the Executive Director of the American Swedish Historical Museum. I'm so glad that you can join us today for this live Q&A. And I hope that this year's conference reaches many more people through the recordings than just who were able to attend today. I found that, like everything else in this pandemic, experiencing the New Sweden History Conference virtually had its pros and cons. I loved that you could pause the speakers and look at their slides for longer, that you could rewind when you didn't catch something. But I truly, truly miss the collegiality of gathering with all of you in person, live, and talking over a cup of coffee and looking at things together. So we miss you this year in that respect, but we are really excited to be hosting this live Q&A so that we can still have that dialogue that we love at the conference. This is the 20th year for the conference, and we have a great committee that put the conference together as an in-person conference and then changed it to this virtual conference. I want to give a special shout out to Lauren Burnham, who really worked very hard to figure out the technology, to put the packets together in a super usable way, and all of the other things that she did to make the virtual part of this conference go smoothly. I hope you noticed the three-part packet. So you had the core part that included the links to the speakers and their bios and their short summaries of their talks. You had supplemental materials from the speakers, sometimes a transcription of their talk, bibliography material, things like that. And then you had information from the partners that present this this conference. So we're grateful for all of the partners who work on this conference because it really is a group effort, and they're all listed there in that packet. A few things about this 1-hour session today. Please, if you have questions for the panelists that you did not submit in advance, click on the Q&A feature rather than the chat feature. So that should be at the bottom of your screen when you hover down there. You can type questions in there. We just want to remind you that this session is being recorded. And we're just going to jump right in. We were hoping to have this conference in historic Newcastle, since so much of what we're talking about is the architecture in Newcastle. But unfortunately, that wasn't possible. But we are still cooperating with the Newcastle Historical Society, and we're happy that Michael Connolly, the executive director of that historical society, agreed to moderate and host this afternoon's session. Michael has a background in historic preservation and business, and he spent 17 years working for small museums and historic sites in our region. So he brings a wealth of experience to the conversation today, and I'm happy to turn it over to him. Michael?
Thanks so much, Tracey. I am very excited to be here. I'm thrilled that the American Swedish Historical Museum asked me to participate and asked the Newcastle Historical Society to be a partner with you on this project conference today. Thanks also to Lauren for all her help in getting things rolling. Obviously, as the Newcastle Historical Society in Newcastle, Delaware, we have an inherent interest in the topics that we're going to be covering today. If anybody's not familiar with the Newcastle Historical Society, I do like to let folks know that we actually are the Historical Society for the city of Newcastle rather than all of Newcastle County. Delaware is so small, we don't have county historical societies. And the other thing that is very interesting for me personally is that over the last year, I was very fortunate to work closely with Wade Katz on the project that he was leading at the site of Fort Casimir. So that's of particular interest to me as well. So let's get started. I will briefly introduce each of our speakers and ask them to take no more than about 5 minutes just to provide you with a very quick synopsis of their presentation, really just as a reminder of their topic, and then we'll get into the actual questions. Thanks to everybody who emailed questions to us in advance. We'll cover those advanced questions first. And as Tracey said, if anybody has a question that they think of during the session, please use that Q&A function to submit it. Many of the questions are very specific to a particular speaker, so I will typically start by directing a question to one person specifically, but then we'll open the discussion to the other panelists to comment on as well. And I'll ask our panelists to keep the responses as brief as possible so we can cover as many questions as we can during the time that we have. Panelists, as I introduce you, please unmute yourself and turn your video back on so we can see you, and we'll get rolling. So the first person I'd like to introduce is George Ambrose. George serves as president of the Friends of the Swedish Cabin, of which he was a founding member. He has numerous publication credits, including, for our purposes specifically, the Log Cabins of New Sweden. While president of the Friends of the Swedish Cabin in the late 80s, he presided over its research, archaeology, and restoration. So, George, over to you.
Thank you, Michael, and thank you to everyone involved in this conference, especially Lauren and the committee that helped put it together. It is, in fact, making history being the first session presented this way, so I'm proud to be part of that historic moment. My talk, if you have seen it, even if you've seen it, was called Hiding in Plain Sight and Looking for the Physical Remnants of New Sweden. I mentioned briefly Dutch presence and English presence in the Delaware River in the time period covered, but concentrate on New Sweden and in particular the buildings, the churches, the forts, the storehouses, and then specifically the log cabins, and focus in on the log cabin that I know best, which is the Lower Swedish Cabin in Delaware County, Pennsylvania, and look at changes that have happened to those cabins over the years and speculate as to why a number of them existed, but virtually none of them exist any longer, and then talk about the need to continue to preserve heritage, as well as highlight some new developments on this subject, like the reconstruction of the New Sweden farmstead in Prince Park. So that's what mine's on. Thank you.
Great, thank you very much, George. Okay, our next panelist that I want to introduce is Wade Katz. Wade is a registered professional archaeologist with more than 35 years of historical research, historical preservation, and cultural resource management experience. He's a lifelong Delawarean and internationally recognized as a historian and historical archaeologist. He has some specific interests in farmsteads, agricultural landscapes, urban development, military history and archaeology, environmental history, African American studies, and Middle Atlantic regional history and historic preservation. So Wade, over to you.
Thank you, Mike. I hope my audio works okay here. Thank you for including me in this conference and for the opportunity to talk a little bit about the archaeological work that we just conducted last year at the site of Fort Casimir. So the presentation that I did was, that I have up for you all to see, is The walls are not nearly half so good as they appear on paper. Archaeological evidence of Fort Casimir, Trafalgar, or Nieuw Amstel, circa 1651 to 1679. The title I had meant to indicate when I gave the presentation, the title is actually from Jacob Ulrich's vice director of the colony in 1657, who notes that the walls, he had just sent a map home to Holland, but he comments on this that he says the walls aren't nearly as good as they appear on paper, which what I think underscores the archaeological work we did and what we're trying to learn here is that the as-built condition of that fortification may look very different than what it was as they drew it and sent the information home. Briefly, there have been a series of archaeological projects at the site of Fort Casimir. There have been in the 1980s. The concern was that we weren't even sure where the fort was. Earlier historical research had suggested that it actually washed out into the Delaware River. But in a way similar to the way we've identified the work that Bill Kelso did in Jamestown, we think we have found a portion of the fort, some element of that still exists. The work was done in the 1980s by Edward Height, and he identified a possible deep feature or ditch, what turns out to be a portion of the ditch. And then more work was done in 2012 and again in 2019 to further investigate. And the work that we did in 2019 actually identified the length of the curtain wall of the ditch for the river side of the fort. It suggests that there, and we also identified what we believe is the gate location. I talked a little bit about that in the presentation. And then the bastions on the northeast and southeast have been obliterated by later work or later things that have occurred on that property. The ditch itself is a pretty remarkable element. It's the ditch that you would need to gain the soil from within that ditch to create the walls of the fort. And we think that the upper layers of that ditch probably date to the period of when the fort was leveled, probably 1677 to 1679, somewhere in that range. But down inside the ditch itself are deposits that are associated with the actual occupation of the fort from about 1651 to its destruction or its seizure by the English in 1664. I'll be glad to answer further questions. I had sent in a little bit of documentation to go with this. We've recently completed the technical report that now will be housed with the Newcastle Historical Society. And I think some of the other artifacts and things will eventually be put on display there as well. So with that, I'll turn this back over to Mike, and I look forward to questions and perhaps questions from amongst the panelists as well. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Wade. All right, our next presenter is Jeroen van den Hurk. Dr. van den Hurk received his PhD in art history from the University of Delaware. His dissertation titled Imagining New Netherland, Origins and Survival of Netherlandic Architecture in Old New York, in which he looked at 17th century architecture and the settlers of New Netherland. Since 2017, he's been an assistant professor in cultural and historic preservation and is currently also the program coordinator for the Noreen Stoner Drexel Cultural and Historic Preservation Program at Salve Regina University in Newport, Rhode Island.
Thank you for the introduction, Mike. Of course, it would have been great if we could have been back in Newcastle. It's been a while since I've been back in Delaware. So just a brief recap of my talk, if you haven't had a chance yet to look at it. And of course, part is based on my dissertation research as well. So relatively little is known about the architecture of New Netherland, and even less about the built environment in the Delaware Bay. Of course, New Netherland itself formally only existed for a very short period. And unfortunately, due to various circumstances, little of its architecture that was built during that period survives. However, we do have numerous colonial manuscripts that survive that tell us about that built environment. And then, of course, we also have some contemporaneous references to this built environment. And there are a few late 17th century, early 18th century buildings that we can tie into those traditions. The manuscripts themselves that survive sort of give us an understanding of the blueprint that these settlers had in mind when they came to New Netherland and how that also, of course, reflected the cultural traditions, the architectural traditions that they had left behind that are, that we can see in the Dutch Republic and the Low Countries. And if we look closely at these contracts from the 17th century from New Netherland and compare them with building contracts from the Dutch Republic, we see that they're very, very similar. And again, and it's also the architecture that they created is distinct from what the English settlers built. Now, many 20th century scholars have actually suggested that, once the English took over, this culture of the settlers of New Netherland was basically, lost in the sea of alien culture. However, journal entries such as those by Dr. Hamilton suggest that in certain areas, the descendants of these initial settlers held on to these cultural traditions for several generations, and in some cases even into the early 19th century. Now, what Hamilton's understanding may have been of what was Dutch, of course, was colored by these sort of complex perceptions of ethnicity. And of course, Hamilton looked at the world through Scottish or English eyes. However, it does become clear that even by 1744, in a place such as Newcastle, there was still a distinct non-English sort of taste or flavor to the architecture, and this goes for other parts of the former colony of New Netherland as well. So if we compare these contrasted surviving buildings, a few surviving buildings, there's the Reeves Holt House and the old Dutch house in Newcastle, but there's others up in Hudson Valley that date to the late 17th, early 18th century. If we compare those to the colonial manuscripts that mention the construction of buildings, then we can sort of, see that there's definitely a relationship there. Of course, this environment was already shaped by the melting pot that was New Netherland, by the different building materials that were available, and of course also the skill level of the craftsmen that were building this. But in many cases, we may even start to look at, perhaps a Dutch American type of architecture that was originated back in the 17th century in places such as New Amstel, and that for the untrained eye may not look anything unusual, but if we put the pieces of the puzzle together, hopefully we can add to the colonial history of North America. So I'll pass it back to Mike.
Okay, thank you so much. Okay, and last but not least, our final speaker, Joseph Matthews. Joseph is currently a counselor of the Swedish Colonial Society, and back around 2012, after retiring, Joseph got involved with the Cumberland County Historical Society in Greenwich, New Jersey, and that's how he became involved specifically with the Swedish granary building that you heard about in the presentation. He considers himself a log building enthusiast, and that's why he is part of this presentation today. Joseph, thanks so much for joining us.
Thank you, Mike. Well, good afternoon, everyone. I've written a hopefully brief summary, and I'll begin. The goal of my presentation was to accurately describe what it took to move the 7 log cabins of the New Sweden Farmstead Museum from where it had been built in 1988 in Bridgeton, New Jersey, to a new home in Governor Prince Park in Essington, part of Tinicum Township, Pennsylvania, on the Delaware River just south of Philadelphia International Airport. Our conference's theme of home on the Delaware really spoke to me because our farmstead really needed a home. And what better place than Prince's Island settlement overlooking the Delaware. I was a project insider by virtue of my being the chairman of the organization that originally built the farmstead, the New Sweden Company, founded in New Jersey in 1982. Their mission was to use the farmstead as a living history museum to teach the history and culture of the Swedish colony on the Delaware. The organization at its peak had many members and an energetic operation. I describe how the 3 builders from Sweden, led by Gunnar Zetterquist, were engaged to build the cabins, and how the King and Queen of Sweden were in attendance at the farmstead's grand opening on April 14th, 1988. It was in operation for about 10 years, I believe. In any case, I became involved long after it closed. And when I joined the New Sweden company in 2013, it had decided to try to move the farmstead to a better site than Bridgeton, which, though it was in the original New Sweden area, was no longer likely to attract many visitors. I described how at this time the Swedish Colonial Society took an interest in our project, pledged support, and led us to consider Prince Park as our best destination. It just so happened that Tinicum Township was about to use income received from the airport to embark upon an improvement project of its parks and the renovation of the 1799 Lazaretto, the first quarantine hospital in the country. The whole waterfront would be improved. I described how we had a treasury of about $10,000 that had to see us through our dismantling of the cabins and their transport to outside storage areas where they had to withstand the weather of several years as we cast about determining where we were headed, and then when that was determined, trying to assemble volunteers and workers. Inconclusive discussions about insurance took place as well. Some logs sprouted fungi, causing us great worry. Eventually, we found our way to Highline Construction, an Amish custom home builder specializing in log construction. Until they began doing the work, I wasn't at all sure we'd get the first cabin built, let alone all 7. However, Highline built that first one, and with it as the first evidence of the intent of our project, the present governor of the Swedish Colonial Society, John Teep, applied for and won a sizable enough grant to very nearly complete the rest of the cabins. All that remains to build are 2 fireplaces. With the Swedish Colonial Society, Tinicum Township, and the local historical society as partners, we all plan to preserve and promote the history and culture of the colony of New Sweden from our picturesque new home on the Delaware. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Joseph. So if I could actually invite all of our panelists to reactivate their video, and I'll start with some of the questions and answers here. And I probably for sound quality purposes, if we keep, if you're not speaking as a panelist, if you keep yourself on mute, and then when you're ready to answer, you can take yourself off. I'm going to start with some direct questions, and then I'll let you know there's also a couple questions that seem very appropriate for the whole panel to chime in on based on your experience. So, George, we're going to start with you again. I have a fairly direct and straightforward question about your presentation. There were 2 terms mentioned in your presentation. And someone asked, what type of structure is a stuga? And I apologize if I'm pronouncing any of these wrong. A stuga or an eldhus?
Hey, they're kind of linear in their progression, and this happened with the New Sweden farmstead when Gunnar Zeidquist came over. He specifically built an eldhouse as the first shelter because that was normally what was happening in the time of New Sweden. When you were about to build, you built this house that would have a future use, but it was temporarily used as the main house until the main house could be built. So the eldhouse is long benches along the 2 long sides, a firebox in the very center, and a hole for the exit of smoke through the roof. And then the stuga cabin is built, and that's the main house, and that sometimes has more than 1 room and would normally contain also a stone fireplace, which would take longer to construct. So after the stuga was built, the eldhouse would become one of those 7 buildings, again, to use a New Sweden farmstead as the model, that could be used as a sauna, could be used as a guest house, could be used as a storehouse, so that it had multi-uses after it became empty and the family moved into the stuga.
Excellent. Thank you very much. I'm going to follow up with you again, George. And this is a question about determining the age of different structures. In your presentation, you mentioned using tree ring analysis to determine the age of the first cabin and the second cabin. And someone was asking how accurate that was. And a similar question came in for Joe. So we'll follow up with a question to Joe, if he could tell us more about his experience with dendrochronology and the dating of the granary. And then after that, if Wade or Dr. Hurk wants to chime in on dendrochronology and anything else about it, please feel free. But we'll start with George, if you'll tell us a little bit more about that. Okay,
well, first I want to make two distinctions. One is tree rings versus dendrochronology. Dendrochronology involves boring a sample into the log and pulling a plug out that obviously includes the rings and is usually matched species to species. So for example, if you were doing something with our cabin, you would be looking at a database of white oak. And one of the shortfalls of dendrochronology for dating, and I think this impacts both the granary and our own cabin, is that, for example, in 1988, when we were doing our restoration, the only white oak building in the database at the time was Independence Hall, which was built in the 1760s, a full 100 years later, 100 years plus later. So there was kind of a forced match, and a date of 1690 was put on our cabin, and I totally reject that date because there was just insufficient data to match it. Now, what I'm talking about in my presentation, on the other hand, were tree rings. We have a 4-wall cabin that a 3-wall addition was built on and anchored onto that original building, and we tried to figure out when the addition was added date-wise in relation to when the first building was constructed. And what we did was we looked at the tree rings on the white oak used in this building, and there were 5 more rings. So that when you look at a slice of tree, there are rings. One 111 rings, the other one has 116. Then you know that the second building was built about 5 years after the first building, and that's how we got the date to the addition to the building. Using tree rings, that's not true dendrochronology.
Thank you for clearing that for us, George. Joseph, do you want to jump in and talk a little bit about the granary?
Sure. I don't know exactly what to say. That tree ring project, or the dendrochronology project that we did with the granary, lasted several years, and I could talk for a long time about it. I'll just mention a couple things. One was the granary is made of Atlantic white cedar, and I can tell you that it was a fascinating project in itself to find actual trees in South Jersey, and then to find Atlantic white cedar timbers in historic buildings. It was really a fascinating thing. Our dendrochronologists were Bill Callahan and Dr. Ed Cook, who's at, I'm forgetting the name, it's the Columbia University school there. And it was just interesting following them around. We also helped them locate such buildings, and I recruited a couple other people who knew a lot, just had sort of innate knowledge of South Jersey buildings, and actually a couple people that help us navigate through the woods to find these huge trees. It was fascinating. I once fell into a bog up to my hip, and this was in winter. So I can, that particular species grows in marshy areas. So it was wonderful. I can say that it was like almost a religious experience to go in there like that. I could go on, but I'll hold off for now.
Thank you. Thank you. Do either of our other panelists want to chime in on this topic? Okay, great. Another question that came up as a result of George's talk, but again, I think the panelists may be able to chime in on this. George had mentioned how some of the Swedish structures had been anglicized, I guess, as the English were coming into the area. And one of the things that he mentioned specifically was the use of window glass in the Delaware Valley. So the question was, what was the source of window glass at that early period? When was it first made here? Anybody can help.
Are you talking about
Mic off here. What?
I'm sorry, go ahead.
There was in fact glass used for windows in New Sweden, and they were used at the Prince-off. And in fact, they were imported from Sweden for that purpose, along with yellow Dutch bricks that were used in the construction of the fireplaces at the Prince-off. It was an ostentatious building for its time, and certainly for the colony of New Sweden. People knew that they were in for a regal governor when they saw what kind of a place he was building for himself and his family. But there was glass manufacturing in America as early as 1608 in Jamestown, Virginia. And what my point is that people want to live in when they come to a new area that are similar or as much alike as the buildings that they left in their first home. And so the English wanted English style houses, the Swedes wanted Swedish style houses. And when William Penn, for example, put a property that had been first settled and built by a Swede up for sale to his English customers, and it had a Swedish cabin on it, the English, and I give the credit to the wife, wanted it anglicized so that it was much more like home, and something that she would like. And windows not only are home but bring in light. And if you've ever been in a cabin like an eld house that we were talking about earlier, because of the absence of windows, and so windows were brought from England initially for the construction of buildings like in the city of Philadelphia, but it was pretty widespread and available by 1700 in this area.
Just to follow up on George, and I just checked my some of my records, but even for New Netherland, as early as 1652, they mentioned the presence of glaziers. So now, of course, the question is, where was the glass coming from, and is it glass that was readily available or only on important buildings? But so there are mentions of using glass, but it may not have been to the same extent as you would see later.
And Wade, you found some glass during your recent project here in Newcastle. Do you want to comment on that?
We did. We had, as I mentioned in the presentation, we did have window glass, which matches to some degree the kinds of windows that Jeroen was mentioning that he was seeing in the Dutch contracts. We're seeing rectangular shaped small panes, and they would fit in with the descriptions that I think he's showing for those. There would have been some window glass in the fortification, but windows are going to be a premium and not particularly easy to come by. So, that kind of supports George's comment that the Prince-off is a fairly significant structure. A fortification is a fairly significant structure. Houses with windows are probably going to be fairly well to do. But Jeroen, you might want to weigh in on that. I might not have that right.
Yeah, I'm afraid that I don't know that much yet about sort of what happens in the Delaware. Most of the records are for New York and places like Albany, but it's definitely that'll keep us busy for the next couple of decades to research that.
Excellent. Okay, thank you. That leads us kind of as a segue into the topic of Fort Casimir. So we have a couple of questions that were for Wade here. One person mentioned that in your presentation, you said that some of the features related to Fort Casimir are very close to the surface. Why is that? Were there no other structures built over it, or is it because much of the hillside, Bull Hill, has been removed?
That's a good question, and it's a combination of both of those things. When we're looking at that site location, you look at what's happened over the succeeding years after the fort goes away, after the fort is removed. The owner in the 1670s is told that he can continue to live there if he raises the fort, if he basically removes whatever vestiges of the fort are left. By the mid-19th century, there are a series of townhouses that are being built in that space, and a coal manufacturer, a coal merchant is located along the river in that space. And then in the 1920s, the Pennsville Newcastle Ferry Terminal is located in that same spot. So all of those things have an effect on what was still left of the fortification. What's left there are, I mentioned that there was a potential for the timbered curtain wall, the exterior wall of the fort, but the feature itself that we identified, the soil stain, was very, very thin, very shallow, because it's been the ground surface above it has basically been sliced away, and so you're down to only a few inches left of that feature. And then the ditch itself, which is the main component of the fort, and as I mentioned earlier, you have to have that ditch in order to gain the dirt to build your wall. So you dig that ditch and then pile that dirt up and form your actual curtain wall. That ditch consists of several feet of fill, but it would have been deeper had Bull Hill not been cut down and sliced. Even within the living memory of people in the town, on portions of Bull Hill, they've explained to me that 3.5 feet of soil had been removed in their lifetime. So probably since the 1950s, there have been cutting and kind of slicing episodes that have occurred. And then the work that when the ferry terminal came in, the southeast bastion is essentially sliced off. And the coal terminal, I think, in the 19th century took out the northeast bastion, as did a lot of erosion occurring through storm tides and storm surges. So it's not unusual that in 1905, Alexander Cooper, who wrote the book on the history of Newcastle, his interpretation was the fort was gone, because he had seen erosion occurring along that riverfront that suggested that the fortification was gone. We have what we're pretty sure, though, is the front wall, not the back wall, because of the gate configuration and the other elements of it that we found. So that all said, the fort, still a large chunk of that fortification is still sitting there. Some portions of it have been probably taken out by the row houses that were built, but it's still a large piece of it is probably still intact.
Another follow-up question related to the fort, or forts, I should say. Are there any other New Sweden era forts currently being excavated? And if so, in which states they be located?
Currently, I'm not aware of any. Archaeological work has been done at both Swedish and Dutch fortification sites in the Delaware River Valley in different times. Burlington Island had a survey done in the late 19th century, actually, and then in the 1980s, Richard Veit from Monmouth University reanalyzed the artifacts that came from that. That was more of a trading post or possibly a fortification, but it was a 1620s fortification or site. Fort Ellsborg had some work done looking in New Jersey for it. That was fairly inconclusive. We have done work in the last decade in the Fort Christina area in Wilmington, which consisted really of soil coring and testing to try to determine how much fill is sitting in that spot in part. And there's a small section of that may actually hold potential for resources like we found at Casimir. There may still be a little bit of that fortification left. So I think that's most of those that have been looked at various times. Nothing actively going on right now on other sites that I'm aware of. And the Prince Off, of course, Marshall Becker did archaeology at the Prince Off, and he was following on work that was done in the 1930s.
Thank you. And then sort of a follow-up question to that. the work that you've done at Fort Casimir is incredibly exciting, as I know too. What needs to happen for more work to be done there? Is anyone actively working to get the next phase of archaeology underway? And if you were going to pick the next place to dig, where would it be?
There's a lot of potential at that site, and we've had these. You and I have had these conversations, but it's useful to think this through. That it's there's likely to be elements of that still in existence, and the parking lot area that's there is probably the first one that comes to mind. We'd like to try to coordinate anything that gets done by the trustees or by the city. If they're doing ground disturbing activities, that would certainly be part of what could be investigated. The archaeological component could be here. This could be a long-term archaeological project if the city or the trustees were interested in doing it. It certainly would be a heritage tourism potential. This it's a pretty remarkable space, and I'd say that the ditch is the area that you'd want to look at. We sampled the ditch with a little bit of work we did. Probably only about 10% of that front riverside wall that we actually examine and excavate. So there's about 90% just of that ditch that's still left, and any other portions of the fortification that might be there. There are a lot of questions that have come up. We've determined what we think is the footprint of that fort based on the archaeology. That's also based on readings of other fortifications that were Dutch period forts that are built throughout the world. As I mentioned, Hans, we had a Hans van Besting from the Holland Foundation came and worked with us. He brings experience from looking at fortifications all over the Dutch Empire, 17th century Dutch Empire. So we may, we are estimating we're in kind of based on our best guess of the excavations. This is where we think the footprint of the fort is. Further archaeology could be done to investigate, is that correct? Are there elements of the interior of the fort left? Now that we've determined its footprint or its exterior wall, what else might we be able to find with that? So this site has got a lot of potential. And I would also say that with potential for climate change and sea level rise, it's actually a threatened resource in some ways. So I'll shut up there and turn it back to you.
Thank you very much. Appreciate all the information. Let's jump over to Dr. Vanden Hurk. I have a few questions for you in your presentation. First one, it appears that H-frame Dutch houses were contract built only. Were they required to be built this way? Was there some type of guild rules or some other something else that caused that?
That's a good question, also an interesting question, because I've used the H-frame to distinguish Netherlandic architecture. I'm always a little cautious with using the term Dutch, but Netherlandic architecture from what the English built. Now, as far as I know, H-bends were not a guild requirement. It was basically part of sort of the structural vocabulary that the settlers had, and that had been used in the Low Countries. And I'm also using the term Low Countries because I know that even going as far south as northern France and over into Germany, they use similar structural frames. So that's basically how a house was built, and that was that the blueprint, as Dietz referred to it, sort of the blueprint they had in mind when they came here, and they just continued as they were used to. Now, tying it in as tying in the architecture of New Netherland and what I consider to be specifically Dutch and connecting it with guilds, I have found a reference from the 17th century where the one of the carpenter guilds in the city of Amsterdam, their masterpiece was actually a requirement that a carpenter could make a crossbar window from a beam of 7 feet long. And so that sort of ties in with the types of windows that the contracts refer to. So the bent itself, I think was just that's how they built. But then being able to construct a specific window was part of certain at least your masterpiece was part of that design. So
thank you. Another question for you. What differences were there between vernacular architecture in the Hudson River Valley versus the Delaware Valley, if any? And what would you attribute those differences to?
So there's definitely, I mean, if you look at it visually, just as the shapes of the buildings, and you go from, you know, from Albany down to northern New Jersey, down to, unfortunately, what's, you know, the minimal things that are left in the Delaware Valley, you can clearly see that there's regional differences. Now, if you peel away those regional differences, they all have a structural H bend. So that's the same. It's just that, you know, up in the Hudson Valley, the brick would have been more readily available, and so they would have built in brick. Certain parts of New Jersey, there would have been neither brick or stone, and so you would see more use of clapboard or weatherboard siding. And so that's one of the reasons. It's the availability of certain building materials that would have shaped this architecture, and then perhaps also the skill level and the number of available carpenters. Now, as I've shown in my talk as well, some of these carpenters traveled, and they would have, you know, traveled all the way from New York down to Newcastle to build. So there are regional differences, even probably early on. Now, once the English take over in 1664, then you get in that extra sort of factor where perhaps certain areas are more inclined to change more rapidly and to, you know, succumb sort of to English influences. And so anything that's Netherlandic may disappear more quickly, whereas in other little pockets where there's more resistance to cultural change, they may survive longer. And so if you go to the sort of where Hudson and Kinderhook up in the middle of the Hudson Valley, you can find some prime examples of Netherlandic architecture that are almost more sort of, you know, Dutch than what was supposedly built before, and those date to the 1730s, and I haven't really figured out why those survive there. Again, unfortunately, what we see in Delaware with the Reeves Holt House, which probably is, you know, was very Dutch, now no longer looks very Dutch because it's been overbuilt so drastically afterwards. So hopefully that sort of answers the question.
That's excellent. Yes, thank you. And then one final question. You mentioned bricks as you're talking about that last question, and someone actually made or asked a question about bricks and sort of the timing of when bricks were becoming available in New Amstel. If it's possible, can you give kind of a chronology of brick as we used it in the Delaware Valley in the 17th century and where the sources were?
So again, this is one of because of a lack of sources or specifically references to the Delaware, makes it a little bit harder, but there are references to New Netherland as a whole, the use of brick. Early on, there's references that brick was used for specifically, because I know you shared the question with me that, you know, of course, when Donkarts comes to Newcastle in 1679, he mentions that most of the houses are made out of wood. And then when Hamilton talks about these old and crazy buildings, he says that most of them are made out of brick. And of course, you know, you have to wonder what happens in those roughly 50, 60 years. Now, if you look at the colonial records, the way that the Dutch used brick oftentimes would have been for partition walls and chimneys and cellars. And so they do mention, you know, somebody, if a house is being sold, the seller actually has to make sure that there's a partition wall and a chimney built out of brick before it's taken on by the other person. There's Stuyvesant in the records mentions Stuyvesant, that he actually owed a debt in bricks. So bricks were used in some cases and I know for the Dutch Republic that in farmhouses or house barns, they used bricks for stable floors. And so those were harder bricks than the bricks they might have built walls with. So again, the records suggest that there were brick kilns during the Dutch colonial period. Again, the quantities are I don't know the quantities, and I haven't done the math yet, that if somebody says, you know, 4,000 bricks, what does that build you? I know there are some references where, of course, that seems to be somewhat of I wouldn't say an urban myth, but, you know, that the bricks were shipped in from the Netherlands, which if you think about, you know, ballast and things like that, it would have been much more profitable for them to shipping goods that they could sell than have that number of ballast bricks to build anything from. Now, there are references that some people have brought in pan tiles and bricks at a smaller level that they paid for it to have it shipped in. But again, that might be the exception to the rule. So I see that George wants to chip in as well.
Well, I feel that I must say something about fireplaces in New Sweden. For example, the Nyckel cabin, although it has a corner fireplace, the fireplace is made from red brick, and red brick has been historically ascribed to English source. Princehoff has a yellow brick fireplace, which were Dutch bricks and were a thinner brick than the traditional English brick. And then the idea of ballast, we have an avenue in Philadelphia that at least partially was renamed Christopher Columbus Boulevard, may go back now for the indigenous outcry, but that whole brick and old city is paved with cobblestones, and those cobblestones were definitely brought over as ballast if they didn't have other cargo. I agree with you that would be a low priority cargo, but if you didn't have it and you needed the ballast, you were happy to put cobblestones on.
Yeah, no, I agree, and I think, and maybe actually Wade might know more about the composition, the fact that, and I think even for the tile house, which Mike, you might know as well, that some of the bricks that survive from the tile house that people have painted on, I guess they're traditionally yellow. Now, and they're in the Netherlands, they're known as IJsselsteen because of the region where the clay is dug to fire those bricks. Now, I don't know if traditionally in the US, you can produce a yellow brick, you can fire a yellow brick. I do know that later on, if they talk about English brick and Dutch brick, oftentimes it actually has to do with the size of the brick and not so much with where it came from. It's just that, the standard sizes for brick were identified as either English or Dutch. So, and again, how language works, then people will, oh, it's a Dutch brick, so it has to have come from, from the Netherlands or the Dutch Republic. But
they used yellow brick to make the road to Oz as well.
Exactly, yes.
Very good. All right. Wade, were you about to chime in, or?
I was just going to comment, and I'd have to go back and check, but I believe that there is Jakob Ulrichs, as the vice director, is consistently asking for brick to be shipped from Albany, because at least in the 1657, 58, 59, the period that he's there are virtually no bricks in New Amstel. And so the construction is not using brick, it's not using roof tile. They are clearly building in probably timber and log. And even in the fort itself, there's not a whole lot. So as the fortification gets built, that's when you're seeing the brick as the Dutch are working on the fort, that's when the brick is being brought in. It's not in the period when the Swedes are there, it's in the period when the Dutch are there. And I believe, and I'd have to check this, and there's probably somebody in attendance who knows this right off the top of their head. I think there is a brick maker who comes to live in New Amstel when the Dutch are in there in the 1650s, but he doesn't stay very long, or he doesn't do a very good job because they don't get anything from him like they were expecting to.
Interesting. Yeah, thank you very much. Let's get into the final presentation. We haven't talked a great deal about the New Sweden Colonial Farmstead, and bring Joe in. Joe, first question for you. When the farmstead was originally constructed in 1987, 88, what were the plans for the buildings based upon?
I actually wrote something, and I'll just read that. The original plans for the farmstead were devised, as far as I know, by the lead builder, Gunnar Zetterquist. I work at Cumberland County Historical Society, which is in possession of many, if not most, of the records of the New Sweden Company. There may be records within this fairly large collection pertaining to the physical farmstead. I haven't found them yet, if there are. So far, all I have found are a few brief interviews of Zetterquist newspaper interviews where he explains how the farmstead would have grown over time, which buildings would have been built first, and the purposes of each building, something that you referred to, George, I remember. I think Zetterquist was trying to replicate buildings that were traditionally built in his province, home province of Dalarna. I'd like to research this question in Sweden, and I might yet do that. But I did visit Skansen last year and saw the cluster of buildings called the Mora Farmstead, which comes out of Dalarna and evokes the time period that Zetterquist was trying to reach, especially with the style of roof he chose for the farmstead in Bridgeton. So I hope that answers some of that question.
Indeed, thanks. And how's now that you're involved with the project at Tinicum, how does the land at Governor Prince Park compare to the former farmstead site, and how's the layout changing? Are they closer together? Are the buildings closer together, arranged differently?
I also wrote something for that. I believe the farmstead takes up a little more space in Tinicum than obtained in Bridgeton. We decided to range the cabins around the so-called New Sweden History Walk, an asphalt walk with signage. We kept the sign standards where they were, though our historian Kim Eric Williams revised the texts of the signs under the original headings. The cabins are placed differently now, but they still form a rectangular courtyard. The building we call the main residence still stands at the head of the courtyard. We adapted to conditions at the park, but we retained the overall courtyard arrangement of Bridgeton. So the cabins individually are, a few of them are in different positions.
Okay.
Yeah.
Also had a couple of questions submitted for you about how the farmstead is going to be interpreted to the public going forward. Have you gotten to the point where you are thinking about exactly how the buildings will be presented to the public, how they might be furnished, if they will be, and that type of
yeah,
concern?
we haven't gotten there yet. Really, the buildings have just really been put up, really ending in September, I think. And no plans have been developed yet, but various organizations have expressed interest in helping with interpretation. The Tinicum Township Historical Society, the New Sweden Center, the township itself, and of course the Swedish Colonial Society, and there may be others. I believe that the Swedish Colonial Society will lead this effort.
Okay, great. Is there a, do you have a date in mind, a goal for when you'd like to see the officially open to the public?
There will be an open house on November 14th. This might be a good opportunity to mention that. We're going to be taking, Tinicum Township holds events in the park, and they're going to have what they call a community day there then. And we're going to have an open house and sort of a fall festival on November 14th from noon to 5. So I invite people to come and look. But as for the COVID situation is probably going to push off the grand opening. I believe we may shoot for spring of next year because that's also when the township is going to be opening up the Lazaretto, which has undergone extensive renovations. So, but as I say, we're going to have this thing on November 14th. So if anybody's interested in seeing the cabins, they'll be opened. I'm not going to go into any cabins just because of COVID, but people will be able to at least look into the cabins.
Okay, excellent. Thank you very much, Joe. I know we're pretty much at our 1 hour mark here, but we still have some questions that have been sent in with Q&A. So if folks are able to stay on, we will continue with that a bit. So let me read questions out to you here. Do we know of any representations of traditional Swedish or Dutch architecture that some of these settlers took westward with them into the Chesapeake area? I'm interested in the eastern shore of Maryland, and I know that some of this area was settled in the 17th century. Thank you. George?
There were settlers who, in particular during the reign of Governor Prince, were very upset with his tyrannical rule and left the settlement to the south that the Swedes had previously traded with. So there was already some kind of a connection. And I looked briefly at the western shores of the Delaware in Maryland, and there are a couple cabins that are, one's called the Coon Cabin, and it has not been dated, and I shudder to think that that was a pejorative term reference to it being originally a slave cabin rather than constructed by early Swedes or whatever. As far as I know, nothing related to New Sweden and Swedish settlers has been found definitively in Maryland.
And I do know that at least one case where there's a Dutchman who settles on the eastern shore of Virginia. I haven't looked into what he built or how he built too closely. Of course, the Dutch have always been known to just sort of go with the flow. And so it's not unlikely that he would have, hired English carpenters or craftsmen to build a house in the style of the region. But I do know that some of the Dutch ended up settling on the Chesapeake Bay as well.
I would add to that certainly Gerrit van Swearingen, who is one of the officers at the fort when it falls in 1664, ends up in St. Mary City, Maryland, and his house is actually a reconstructed space and one that can be looked at if you go down to historic St. Mary's. Also, you have other individuals who probably were part of the Dutch, the Dutch movement out of the valley, out of the Delaware River Valley across to the Chesapeake, Swedish settlers as well. Those archaeological sites are sitting out there. It'd be great to go find them, but they're going to be, the likelihood that a log structure is going to survive several hundred years like that is pretty low. So they're going to be archaeological footprints, not necessarily standing structures.
Very good. All right. Thank you. I have another question here, and I'm going to apologize in advance for the pronunciation that I'm about to make on these names. How important that many of the Swedish settlers were from Skogsvanar, from Dalarna Varmland regions, who were experienced with forest clearing and stuga building in their isolated homesteads. Anyone on that one?
I can say that there was definitely a movement when the country that is now Finland was part of Sweden. The king wanted to expand cities like Stockholm and brought forest burning Finns down to live in provinces like Varmland and had them start clearing the forest, and the process was estimated to take about 100 years to do, and in fact the Finns did it in about 10 years and quickly became outlaws, and that's how they wound up getting the alternative choice of sentence of jail or hanging in Sweden, or go and settle in this land, America, that well-established, prospering Swedes had no interest in. But the Finns, as an alternative to prison and to get away from Swedish authorities, chose to come to America. The fact that Finns were the people that were pressed into service reminds me of using outlaws and prisoners to settle Australia. The Finns that came were the ones that built a lot of that material culture and constituted a majority of the settlers that were on board those ships that came to America. So I think in that sense they were very important, because they brought that material culture with them, and they had a lifestyle. If you read Terry Jordan's book about the American backwoods frontier, fabulous book about Curlian Finns and their sympathetic lifestyles to the Native Americans that they encountered here, and how a boy became a man by killing a bear. They used all parts of the reindeer here. In America, they used the reindeer. There were intermarriages because the Finns mostly were men that were coming here, and so that their wives were chosen among the natives. So there was a physical connection between the two, a cultural connection. They both use slash and burn agriculture. It's a fantastic similarities of lifestyles, and so I think it's very important, and it helped cement those famous peaceful relations that this Swedish colony had with native peoples that the other European countries.
Great, thank you very much, George. We have one final question that came in that hasn't been answered through the Q&A yet, and this one's specifically for Joe. Joe, can you talk about the Dutch yellow bricks that were used in Prinshof and that will now be used at the Tinicum farmstead?
Well, yes, there's actually a fireplace in this building, the American Swedish Historical Museum, that's made of yellow bricks that came from the Prinshof, I believe. We have pieces. We have quite a supply now of pieces of bricks that we're going to use when we build our fireplaces. But since we want to have an actual working fireplace, these pieces will probably be used decoratively. I'd like to have a real fireplace with bricks that will withstand the heat. So we're in the act now of designing this fireplace. And I believe one of you mentioned, I think it was George, I really want to talk with you about fireplaces. So, but I really, was there any specific question about these bricks that the person asked? I don't know how much.
No, just a general question for you to describe them, so. Thank you.
You're welcome.
And I think that's all the questions that we had. So I think we're about to wrap up the panel discussion here. So I'm going to thank all of our panelists, and I'm going to turn it back to Tracey and Lauren here.
Hi, everyone. I'm Lauren. I just wanted to say a big thank you again to all of our panelists, as well as Mike for hosting and being a wonderful moderator. So we really do appreciate the time that you put into that. And thank you for sharing all of the information. And I encourage everyone to please go and explore all of our partner organizations. It truly does take a village to make this conference happen. Each of our partners that either are on our committee or help us advertise, get the word out about the conference, and really do provide a lot of the general information. And so, Mike, I know you're from the Newcastle Historical Society, so we really do encourage everyone to please get down there and check out these sites for yourself. In conclusion, I would just like to remind everyone that at the end of this, when you close out of Zoom, you'll be prompted to fill out a survey. And again, this is the first year that we have done the conference in this format. And so we really appreciate your feedback, anything that you can provide just to help us go forward. I know some of you are new to this conference and some of you have attended for many years, and we really do appreciate your following and your support. So I think that is the conclusion, and thank you again to all of our speakers and Mike. So have a great day, everyone. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.